In the frozen wasteland of Wyoming Territory, 1887, a pregnant woman's desperate journey would change everything. When every creek in dry mercy sealed shut from a killing freeze, 8-month pregnant Eliza Carter wrapped burlap around her swollen feet and began walking 100 miles through blizzard country alone. Her neighbors were dying of thirst. The town's only well had collapsed. Her husband lay buried under barn timber, and no horse remained to trade. With 2 empty canteens and a heart full of fierce determination, Eliza shouldered a wooden yoke and set out for the rumored hot springs beyond Black Elk Ridge, knowing she might never return. 3 nights into her frozen march, frostbite claimed her toes and labor pains flickered like distant lightning. She collapsed beside the ice-locked Sweetgrass River, certain both she and her unborn child would become another winter casualty. That's where Rowan Ashford found her, the reclusive heir to Wyoming's largest ranch, a man who would not only save her life, but offer something she never expected: his hand in marriage and partnership in both land and love. But would a desperate woman's courage and a lonely cowboy's proposal be enough to overcome the deadly forces that controlled the water her people desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wedding ring lay on the rough-hewn nightstand like a circle of broken promises, catching the pale morning light that filtered through the cabin's single window. Eliza Carter stared at the simple gold band, Thomas's grandmother's ring, passed down through 3 generations of homesteaders who'd believed this harsh land could cradle dreams if you held them tight enough. She'd worn it for 4 years, through seasons of plenty and lean times that tested the bonds of marriage like winter wind testing roof timbers. Now, as she prepared to leave it behind, the ring seemed to hold all the weight of the life she was abandoning to save the lives of others. 3 months had passed since the barn roof caved in during that October blizzard, taking Thomas with it in a cascade of snow-heavy timber and shattered hopes. The other men had dug him out too late, his body crushed beneath beams he'd raised with his own hands the spring they'd married. Eliza had stood over his grave in the settlement's small cemetery, 8 months heavy with the child he'd never meet, listening to Reverend McKenna's words drift away on the same wind that now sealed every creek solid as stone. Dry mercy had never been Eden, but it hadn't always been purgatory either. When Eliza first arrived in 1882 as a 22-year-old telegraph operator, the settlement boasted 43 souls, a general store that doubled as post office, and enough optimism to believe the railroad survey markers meant prosperity was just around the bend. The Western Union had stationed her there to handle messages for the survey crews and the steady trickle of homesteaders filing claims on sections that looked promising on government maps but proved as stubborn as mules in reality. She'd met Thomas on a Tuesday in May when he'd come to send word to his sister in Ohio that he'd successfully filed on 160 acres along Willow Creek. His hands were already rough from breaking sod, but they were gentle when he helped her adjust the telegraph key that had been sticking all morning. He'd lingered after sending his message, asking questions about her work that showed genuine interest rather than the patronizing curiosity most men displayed toward a woman in telegraphy. "Must get lonely," he'd said, "listening to other folks' words all day but not having much chance for conversation yourself." "Words have their own company," she'd replied, surprising herself with the honesty. "Each message tells a story, even the short ones, especially the short ones, sometimes." He'd smiled at that, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and stayed there, even after his mouth relaxed. "I'd like to hear some of those stories sometime, if you're inclined to share them." They'd been married by Christmas in a ceremony held in the general store, with most of the settlement crowded around them like family. Mrs. Gunderson had baked a cake with precious white sugar, and old Pete Hernandez had brought out his guitar to play waltzes while couples danced on the plank floor. Even now, preparing to face the wilderness alone, Eliza could hear the echo of that music and feel Thomas's hand warm at the small of her back as they'd swayed together in the lamplight. The settlement had grown in those early years, reaching 68 residents by the summer of 1885. Families arrived with wagons full of hope and children, drawn by stories of good water and soil that would grow anything if you loved it enough. The Hendersons had built a proper schoolhouse. Doc Matthews had arrived with his black bag and gentle manner, bringing the first real medical care the settlement had known. There'd been talk of a church, maybe even a newspaper once the railroad came through. But the railroad never came. The survey crews packed up their instruments and moved on to more promising routes, leaving behind only wooden stakes that gradually weathered grey and tilted like headstones in an abandoned cemetery. The drought started the following summer, lasting through 2 growing seasons that left gardens withered and cattle standing hollow-eyed around empty waterholes. Some families packed up and moved on. Others stayed, betting their lives on the belief that the next year would be better. Then came the winter of 1886, fiercer than anyone could remember. The early freeze in November caught everyone unprepared, sealing creeks and springs that had never frozen completely before. By December, they were melting snow for drinking water and rationing what little they could collect. The main wellhand dug by the settlement's founders and lined with fieldstone cracked in the January cold, its walls collapsing inward like a broken promise. Now, as February's bitter wind howled around the cabin walls, Dry Mercy was down to 31 souls, all of them counting days by how much water remained in their stored containers. Children cried from thirst that couldn't be quenched with the thin gruel their mothers made from melted snow. The elderly sat quiet in their chairs, understanding without words being spoken that they might not see spring. Eliza moved carefully around the cabin, her pregnancy making every task deliberate and slow. She packed her few belongings into Thomas's old saddlebags, a spare dress, her father's worn Bible, the small leather pouch containing her telegraph instruments from her working days. The wooden yoke Thomas had carved their first winter together, originally meant for carrying water buckets from the well now, would carry empty canteens she prayed to fill at the hot springs beyond Black Elk Ridge. Mrs. Gunderson had tried to talk her out of the journey yesterday, her weathered hands gripping Eliza's shoulders with desperate strength. "Child, you can't walk 100 miles in your condition. Not in this cold. Think of the baby." "I am thinking of the baby," Eliza had replied quietly, "and of your grandchildren, and the Morrison twins, and everyone else who'll be dead in a week if someone doesn't reach those springs." The old woman's eyes had filled with tears that froze on her cheeks in the bitter air. "Then God go with you, because the rest of us surely can't." Standing now in the pre-dawn darkness, Eliza wrapped strips of burlap around her swollen feet, layering them over the wool socks Thomas had knitted for her the winter before he died. Her boots had finally given out completely, the leather cracked beyond repair and the soles worn through to her stockings. The burlap would have to do, tied tight with rope and covered with canvas scraps to keep out the worst of the snow. She lifted the wooden yoke to her shoulders, feeling its familiar weight settle across her back like an old friend's embrace. Thomas had carved it from oak, smoothing the wood until it felt like silk under her hands, balancing it perfectly so it wouldn't strain her neck during long carries. He'd never imagined it would carry his widow across 100 miles of winter wilderness, but then none of them had imagined a lot of things. The 2 canteens knocked empty against her hips as she opened the cabin door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving snow into her face and stealing her breath. Somewhere in the settlement, a baby was crying, the Hendersons' youngest, probably colicky from hunger and the stress his parents couldn't hide. The sound cut through her heart like a blade, reminding her why she had to try this impossible thing. She turned back once to look at the wedding ring on the nightstand, its gold surface reflecting the dying embers in the fireplace. Thomas would understand, she told herself. He'd always understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of being strong enough to carry what others couldn't. The ring would wait for her here, in this cabin that had sheltered their love, ready to remind her of home when she returned. If she returned, the wind gusted again, rattling the windows and moaning through the gaps in the chinked logs. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, the settlement's few remaining lights twinkling behind her like stars fallen to earth. Each step crunched through snow that reached nearly to her knees, but she kept walking, her breath forming clouds that the wind scattered before they could fully form. Behind her, Dry Mercy slept fitfully, its people conserving energy and hope in equal measure. Ahead lay 100 miles of wilderness that had claimed stronger travelers than a pregnant woman with burlap-wrapped feet. But Eliza Carter had spent 4 years learning that survival sometimes meant doing impossible things, and love sometimes meant walking away from everything you held dear to save what mattered most. The baby kicked inside her, a flutter of movement that felt like encouragement. She placed one mittened hand on her belly and kept walking into the white darkness, carrying empty vessels toward distant springs that might hold salvation or might be nothing more than another broken promise in a land that specialized in breaking them. The wooden yoke cut into her shoulders with each step, its familiar weight transformed into something cruel by the endless miles ahead. Thomas had carved it during their first winter together, working by firelight with tools his father had left him, shaping the oak with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. He'd tested the balance obsessively, adjusting the curve until it rested perfectly across her frame, making the daily trips to the well feel effortless, even when the buckets hung heavy with water. Now, empty canteens knocked against her hips in hollow rhythm as she struggled through knee-deep snow, each step a negotiation between determination and the growing ache in her lower back. The baby had been restless all night, pressing against her ribs as if sensing the journey ahead. At 8 months, her belly made walking awkward even on level ground, but the terrain between Dry Mercy and Black Elk Ridge was anything but level. The first miles passed in darkness so complete it seemed solid, broken only by the occasional grunt of some unseen animal moving through the timber. Eliza had wrapped strips of white cloth around her ankles so she could see her own feet in the snow, a trick her father had taught her during the winter they'd spent snowed in at his mining claim in Colorado. That had been 20 years ago, when she was still young enough to think adventure was something you chose, rather than something that chose you. By dawn, the settlement had disappeared behind the rolling hills, leaving her alone in a landscape that stretched white and featureless toward the horizon. The wind had died to a whisper, but the cold remained sharp enough to make her lungs ache with each breath. She stopped to rest against a lightning-struck pine, its blackened trunk rising from the snow like a monument to nature's power to destroy. The silence was absolute, pressing against her eardrums until she found herself humming an old hymn just to prove sound still existed. Amazing Grace had been her mother's favorite, sung in a voice that could gentle colicky babies and comfort grieving widows with equal ease. Eliza's voice cracked in the thin air, but she kept humming, letting the melody provide rhythm for her steps. The second day brought the storm. She'd seen it building on the western horizon, a dark wall of clouds that swallowed the peaks like a slow avalanche. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide except a grove of aspens that provided little more than psychological shelter. The wind returned with vengeance, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and erasing her tracks as fast as she could make them. She'd prepared for this, or tried to. The canvas tarp Thomas had used for covering hay could be rigged into a lean-to if she could find the right spot, but the wind made every attempt futile. Finally, exhausted and shivering despite her layers of wool and canvas, she stumbled upon salvation in the form of a trapper's cabin, abandoned but still sound enough to keep out the worst of the storm. The door hung askew on leather hinges, creaking in the wind like a tired old man's joints. Inside, the cabin was sparse but dry, furnished with nothing more than a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a sleeping platform built against the far wall. Someone had left a small stack of split wood beside the hearth, and Eliza sent up a prayer of gratitude for whatever soul had shown such foresight. Getting a fire started with numb fingers took longer than it should have, but eventually flames began licking at the kindling, casting dancing shadows on the chinked log walls. The warmth felt like resurrection, bringing feeling back to her cheeks and allowing her to finally remove the ice-crusted mittens that had frozen to her hands. It was then she noticed the telegraph key. It sat on the wooden table like an artifact from another life, its brass contacts tarnished green, but still recognizably the same model she'd used for 4 years in Dry Mercy. Someone had rigged it to a small battery and a length of wire that disappeared through a chink in the logs, though God only knew where the wire led or if it still carried signals to anywhere that mattered. Eliza ran her fingers over the familiar lever, muscle memory making her thumb and forefinger automatically assume the proper position. Dot, dash, dot, 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 dash. The rhythm of Morse code was like breathing to her, natural as heartbeat. She'd learned it from her father, who'd worked the telegraph lines for the Denver and Rio Grande before the mine called him away from civilization. Words travel faster than horses, he used to say, and they don't need feeding or rest. A good operator can talk to someone 1,000 miles away as easy as talking to someone across the room. The memory brought tears that froze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. Her father had died in that mine collapse when she was 19, leaving her with telegraph skills and a fierce independence that had carried her to Dry Mercy and Thomas and this moment of impossible choice. She tapped out a practice message on the silent key. "Hello, anyone listening?" The clicks echoed in the empty cabin, answered only by the wind howling through the gaps in the door frame. Whoever had rigged this station was long gone, but the equipment remained, waiting for fingers that remembered its language. The storm raged for 18 hours, giving her time to rest and think and feel the baby moving restlessly inside her. She melted snow for drinking water and ate some of the jerky and hardtack she'd packed, rationing carefully against the days ahead. The fire had to be fed constantly to keep the cabin warm enough for survival, and she found herself dozing between trips to the woodpile. Exhaustion, finally overcoming the discomfort of sleeping on a wooden platform, with 8 months of pregnancy weighing on her spine. Dreams came in fragments. Thomas working in their garden, the sun warm on his shoulders as he planted beans in neat rows. The sound of the telegraph key clicking out urgent messages during the spring floods of '84, when half the territory was underwater and every settlement needed to know which routes remained passable. Her father's hands guiding hers on the key for the first time, his patient voice explaining the difference between a dot and a dash, between a message sent clearly and one lost in static. She woke to silence, so complete it felt wrong. The storm had passed, leaving behind air so still she could hear her own heartbeat. Outside, fresh snow had drifted against the cabin walls, but the sky was clear enough to show stars, scattered like broken glass across black velvet. Time to move. The baby was due in a month, maybe less, and Black Elk Ridge still lay 70 miles ahead, through country that would only get rougher. She packed the canvas tarp and checked her supplies, calculating water against distance, against the strength left in her legs. The wooden yoke settled onto her shoulders like an old burden gladly resumed. Thomas had carved their initials into the oak TC and EC, joined by a heart that now felt more like a prayer than a decoration. As she pushed through the cabin door into the crystal-clear morning, Eliza touched those carved letters and made a promise to the memory they represented. "I'll bring them home, Thomas. All of them." The third day brought country that challenged every step. The terrain climbed steadily toward the foothills, and the snow deepened to mid-thigh in places where the wind had carved drifts between the trees. Each mile took longer than the last, and by afternoon she could feel something changing in her body, a loosening, a settling that made her stop and lean against a boulder until the sensation passed. "Not yet," she told the baby silently. "Not here, not now. Wait until we reach the springs. Wait until there's hope to bring home." But babies, she was learning, kept their own schedule regardless of their mother's plans. The first real contraction caught her just as the sun touched the western peaks, a band of tightness across her belly that made her gasp and stumble. She braced herself against a pine tree, breathing slowly until it passed. then kept walking because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing everyone who was counting on her. The contractions came irregularly, at first 20 minutes apart, then 15, then a gap of 30 minutes that made her hope they'd stopped entirely. But as darkness fell and she found herself stumbling through snow that reflected starlight like crushed diamonds, they returned with growing insistence. Sweetgrass River appeared ahead like a silver ribbon frozen in moonlight, its banks marked by willows that stood black and skeletal against the snow. This was supposed to be running water, fed by springs that never froze. But the cold had been so severe, even this creek had surrendered to winter's grip. She made it another 100 yards before her legs simply stopped obeying her will. The contraction that dropped her to her knees lasted nearly a minute, squeezing her belly like a giant fist while stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed to mock her predicament. When it finally released her, she found herself sitting in snow that immediately began soaking through her skirts, the wooden yoke lying beside her like an abandoned hope. This was where she would die then, beside a frozen creek, 70 miles from the springs that might have saved her people, 30 miles from the settlement that would share her fate. The baby moved inside her, a flutter of life that deserved better than a grave in unmarked snow. Eliza Carter closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the only words that came were her father's voice teaching her telegraph code. Every message matters, little sparrow. Even when you can't see who's listening, someone always is. Keep sending until your battery dies or help arrives. The wooden yoke gleamed pale in the starlight, carved with love, and carried this far by will alone. She reached for it with numb fingers, pulling it close against her chest, like a shield against the cold and dark, and the growing certainty that some journeys end differently than hoped. The telegraph key from the abandoned cabin haunted her dreams as she lay curled against the wooden yoke, using it as both pillow and windbreak in the bitter darkness beside Sweetgrass River. Between contractions that came and went, like cruel reminders of time running out, her mind drifted back to those 4 years behind the telegraph desk in Dry Mercy, when her fingers had been the conduit for 1,000 urgent messages spanning the width of the territory. She'd been good at the work, better than good, actually. Her father had trained her well in the subtle art of reading not just the words, but the rhythm behind them. The way panic made some operators rush their dots, and fear made others hesitate between letters. During the flood season, she'd worked 18-hour shifts, relaying evacuation orders and supply requests, while the Western Union lines hummed with desperate traffic from a dozen settlements fighting the rising water. Emergency at Twin Forks. She'd tapped out one memorable night in April of '84, her fingers flying over the brass key while rain hammered the roof of the telegraph office. Bridge out. 20 families stranded on high ground. Send boats to Miller's Crossing. The response had come back within minutes. Boats dispatched. Eat at dawn. Keep line open. For 6 hours, she'd maintained contact with Twin Forks, passing along updates on water levels and casualty reports, coordinating the rescue effort that eventually saved 19 of the 20 families. Only old Henrik Larsen had been lost, swept away when he'd tried to ford the creek to reach his cattle. His death had weighed on her for weeks afterward, though everyone said there was nothing more she could have done. Now, lying in snow that was slowly stealing the warmth from her body, Eliza wondered if her own death would weigh on anyone the same way. Thomas was beyond caring, sleeping his eternal sleep in Dry Mercy's frozen cemetery. The baby inside her deserved better than to die before drawing first breath. And the 31 souls back in the settlement, they were counting on a miracle she was increasingly certain she couldn't deliver. Another contraction gripped her, this one stronger than the last, making her bite down on her mitten to keep from crying out into the empty night. When it passed, she found herself thinking about the message that had changed everything, the telegram that had brought Thomas into her life and set them both on the path that led to this moment. It had been a Tuesday in May, the kind of spring day when the air smelled of new grass and possibility. She'd been adjusting the telegraph key that had been sticking all morning, cursing the humidity that seemed to affect the mechanism's sensitivity, when she'd heard boots on the wooden steps outside the office. "Afternoon, miss," Thomas had said, removing his hat as he'd entered the small room that served as both telegraph office and her living quarters. "I need to send word to my sister in Ohio." She'd looked up from the stubborn key to find herself facing a man maybe 5 years older than herself, with work-calloused hands and eyes the color of storm clouds. His brown hair was neatly combed despite the wind outside, and his clothes were clean but worn, careful grooming of a man who owned little but took pride in what he had. "Of course," she'd replied, gesturing toward the wooden chair beside her desk. "What would you like to say?" He dictated his message slowly, thinking over each word. "Martha. Filed claim on 160 acres along Willow Creek. Good water. Decent soil. House started. Will write longer letter when time permits. Your brother, Thomas." The message had cost him 47 cents, nearly half a day's wages for most men, but he'd counted out the coins without hesitation. As she'd tapped out the letters on the key, she'd been aware of him watching her hands move across the brass contacts, following the rhythm of dots and dashes with obvious fascination. "Must get lonely," he'd said when she'd finished sending. "Listening to other folks' words all day, but not having much chance for conversation yourself." "Words have their own company," she'd answered, surprising herself with the honesty. "Each message tells a story, even the short ones, especially the short ones sometimes." His smile had transformed his whole face, lighting up those storm cloud eyes with warmth that seemed to reach right through her reserve. "I'd like to hear some of those stories sometime, if you're inclined to share them." She'd found herself saying yes before she'd quite realized she was going to. There had been something about Thomas Carter that had cut straight through the careful walls she'd built around her heart, something genuine and steady that had made her want to trust again. They'd walked along Willow Creek that evening, following the meandering path that would later become their daily route to check the garden and tend the animals. He'd shown her the spot where he planned to build their house-a-knot, just his house, though he'd been careful not to presume too much, and described his vision of a place where they could raise children and grow old together, watching the seasons change. "I know it's not much to offer," he'd said, standing knee-deep in prairie grass that waved like water in the evening breeze. "But I've got 2 good hands and a willingness to work, and I think maybe we could build something lasting here." The memory brought fresh tears that froze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. They had built something lasting, just not in the way either of them had imagined. Love had taken root between them despite the harsh soil of frontier life, growing strong enough to carry her through his death and sustain her even now as she lay dying beside a frozen creek. The baby kicked, a sharp reminder that some kinds of love transcended even death. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life that pulsed inside her like a telegraph message tapped out in rhythm with her heartbeat. This child would carry something of Thomas forward into whatever future awaited, assuming they both survived the night. Dawn was still hours away, but already she could feel the cold seeping deeper into her bones, making her thoughts sluggish and her breathing shallow. The contractions had slowed but not stopped, coming now every half hour or so like clockwork, ticking toward an inevitable conclusion. She thought about the telegraph key in the abandoned cabin, wondering if the wire still carried signals to anyone who might be listening. Her father had always insisted that messages found their way to the people who needed to hear them, even when the intended recipient was beyond reach. Sometimes, he'd told her during one of their evening lessons on the mining claim, you send a message for one person and it gets heard by someone else entirely. That's not failure, that's Providence working through copper wire and good intentions. Maybe that's what this whole impossible journey was, a message sent into the wilderness in hope that someone would be listening when she needed help most. She'd carried the wooden yoke and empty canteens as far as her strength would take her, broadcasting her desperate need across miles of snow and silence. The wind picked up, whispering through the bare branches of the willows that lined the frozen creek. In that sound, she thought she heard something like Morse code dots and dashes of meaning she couldn't quite decipher. Her father would have told her to listen harder, to trust that understanding would come to those who kept their ears open and their hearts ready. Eliza Carter pulled the wooden yoke closer against her chest and closed her eyes, listening to the wind's message and waiting for whatever answer the morning might bring. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through Eliza's fading consciousness like a blade through fog, rhythmic and purposeful against the muffled silence of snow-covered ground. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the pale morning light that made the frozen landscape gleam like polished silver. Her body had gone beyond cold into a numbness that felt almost comfortable, which she knew was dangerous. The final kindness hypothermia offered before it claimed another victim. The horseman emerged from a grove of bare cottonwoods, like something from a fever dream, his mount's breath streaming white plumes in the bitter air. He sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in a buffalo coat that made his broad shoulders look even wider, and for a moment Eliza wondered if she'd already died, and this was some sort of celestial messenger come to guide her soul to whatever lay beyond. Then he swung down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, and she could see he was flesh and blood concerned, flesh and blood, judging by the way his eyes widened when he spotted her crumpled form beside the frozen creek. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education, overlaid with the practical roughness of frontier life. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Eliza tried to speak, but managed only a croak that sounded more animal than human. Her lips were cracked and swollen, her throat raw from breathing the knife-sharp air for 3 days and nights. The man dropped to his knees beside her, pulling off his leather gloves to check her pulse with gentle, efficient movements. "Easy now," he murmured, his fingers warm against her frozen wrist. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need to know, are you alone? Is there anyone else who needs help?" She managed a weak shake of her head, then gasped as another contraction seized her belly like a giant's fist. The man's eyes went wide as he registered her obvious pregnancy, and she saw something shift in his expressiona, kind of desperate determination that suggested this meant more to him than simple Christian charity. "How far along?" he asked, his hands already moving to lift her despite her protests. "When did the pain start?" 8 months, she whispered, the words barely audible even in the morning stillness. "Last night. They're getting stronger." He cursed again, but softly, like a prayer turned inside out. "My name's Rowan Ashford. I own the Star, a ranch, about 5 miles north of here. I'm going to take you there. We've got a line cabin that's warm and dry, and my foreman knows something about birthing." The name Ashford was familiar, though it took her cold-addled brain a moment to place it. Star A Ranch was legendary throughout the territory, one of the largest spreads in Wyoming, owned by a family that had made their fortune in cattle and mining back when the territory was still young enough for such fortunes to be made. The Ashfords were rumored to be rich enough to buy and sell entire towns, though they kept to themselves on their sprawling holdings in the foothills. As Rowan lifted her into his arms, Eliza caught sight of his face in the clear morning light. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of winter sky. There was something haunted in those eyes, a shadow that spoke of loss, carried too long and too close to the heart. "The yoke," she managed to say as he carried her toward his horse. "Please, it was my husband's." Without question, he shifted her weight to one arm and retrieved the wooden yoke, hooking it over his saddle horn before lifting her up in front of him. The horsey big bay, gelding with the kind of conformation that spoke of careful breeding, stood rock-steady as Rowan settled her against his chest and wrapped his buffalo coat around them both. "Hold on," he murmured against her ear. "The cabin's not far, but we need to move fast." The ride passed in a blur of motion and warmth, Rowan's arms solid around her as his horse picked its way carefully through the snow-covered terrain. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of him speaking to her in low, reassuring tones about nothing in particular, the weather, his horse's name, Thunder. The way the morning light made the peaks look like they were carved from blue glass. It was the kind of gentle chatter she remembered from her childhood, when her father would talk her through thunderstorms and nightmares with steady words that meant less than the comfort of his presence. There was something in Rowan Ashford's voice that spoke of practice with fear and pain, as if he'd learned the healing power of simple human connection through hard experience. The line cabin appeared ahead like a promise of salvaciona, solid log structure, with smoke already rising from its chimney and windows that glowed golden in the morning light. Someone had seen them coming. A figure emerged from the doorway as they approached, and Eliza heard Rowan call out in what sounded like a mix of English and Cheyenne. "Two Moons, I need your help here. We've got a woman in labor, half frozen and still weeks from her time." The man who came to meet them was older than Rowan, maybe 50, with silver-streaked black hair braided down his back and a face that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. His eyes were dark and kind as he looked down at Eliza, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cadence of someone who thought carefully before choosing words. "Bring her inside. The fire is ready, and I have pine pitch warming for frostbite. How long was she in the cold?" "All night at least, maybe longer." Rowan dismounted with her still in his arms, moving with swift efficiency toward the cabin door. "She was unconscious when I found her, and the baby's coming whether we're ready or not." The cabin's interior was blissfully warm, heated by a stone fireplace that threw dancing shadows on the chinked log walls. 2 Moons had already prepared for medical work-clean cloths laid out on a rough wooden table, water heating in iron pots, and the sharp scent of pine resin that spoke of traditional remedies applied with modern understanding. As Rowan laid her on the sleeping platform near the fire, Eliza caught sight of something that made her heart skip a small silver locket hanging from a nail on the wall, catching the firelight like a distant star. It was the kind of keepsake a man might treasure if he'd lost someone dear, polished smooth by fingers that touched it often in moments of remembrance. "The locket," she whispered, her voice stronger now that warmth was beginning to return to her limbs. Was she your wife?" Rowan's face went still, and for a moment she thought she'd crossed some line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then his expression softened, and he reached up to touch the locket with gentle fingers. "My fiancée, Catherine. She died 2 winters ago. Pneumonia took her before I could get her to a doctor." His voice was quiet, matter of fact, but Eliza could hear the weight of self-recrimination underneath. "I swore then that I'd never again let someone die for lack of help when I had the power to provide it." Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, and she gripped the rough woolen blankets 2 Moons had spread over her. When it passed, she found both men watching her with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the gravity of the situation. "Why were you out there alone?" Rowan asked gently. "In your condition, in this weather, there had to be a powerful reason." So she told them, her voice growing stronger as the warmth continued to seep back into her bones. She told them about dry mercy and the failed well, about the 31 souls counting days until their stored water ran out, about the hot springs beyond Black Elk Ridge that might provide salvation if someone could reach them and bring word back. When she finished, the 2 men exchanged a look that spoke of communication deeper than words. 2 Moons nodded slightly, and Rowan's jaw tightened with what looked like resolve. "Those springs," Rowan said slowly, "they're on Silas Rourke's land now. Railroad baron out of Denver. He dammed the outflow to power his ore crushers, and he's got armed guards who shoot trespassers on sight." Eliza's heart sank. Of course it couldn't be simple. Nothing ever was. Out here where survival was always a negotiation with forces bigger and more ruthless than individual will. "But," Rowan continued, his eyes meeting hers with something that might have been the beginning of hope, "there might be another way. If we're clever about it, and if we're willing to take some considerable risks." The baby kicked inside her, strong and insistent, as if responding to the possibility that they might all survive this after all. Eliza placed both hands on her belly and looked into the faces of these 2 men who had appeared in her darkest hour, like angels of the most practical sort. "Tell me," she said. The Star A Ranch brand iron hung on the cabin wall like a promise carved in metal, its bold star design surrounded by the flowing A that had marked Ashford cattle for 3 generations. Rowan's grandfather had commissioned it from a blacksmith in Denver back in 1858, when the territory was still wild enough that a man's brand was often the only law he could count on. Now, as Eliza studied the iron's familiar lines while Two Moons applied warm pine pitch to her frostbitten toes, that brand represented everything Rowan stood to lose if their desperate plan failed. 31 people, Two Moons murmured as he worked, his weathered hands gentle despite their obvious strength, including the children and the unborn one. His dark eyes flicked toward Eliza's belly, where the baby had finally settled into relative quiet after hours of restless movement. The number matters. In my grandmother's teaching, 31 is powerful. It speaks of completion and new beginnings. Eliza winced as circulation returned to her damaged feet, bringing with it the sharp burn of reawakening nerve endings. "I'm not sure your grandmother's teachings account for railroad barons and armed guards," she said, though not unkindly. There was something about Two Moons that invited both respect and candor, quality of deep listening that suggested he heard more than just the words people spoke. "Silas Rourke arrived in the territory 18 months ago," Rowan said, settling into the cabin's single chair with the careful movements of a man carrying invisible wounds. "Bought up mineral rights all through the Sweetgrass Valley, then started building his operation like he owned the whole watershed, which, legally speaking, he pretty much does." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Eliza found herself studying his face in the firelight, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands clenched unconsciously when he spoke Rourke's name. This was personal for him. She realized not just about her crisis or even the larger question of water rights, but about something that cut closer to home. "He holds the lien on Starray," Rowan continued, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "My father borrowed against the ranch to buy breeding stock just before he died, thinking the railroad boom would make cattle more valuable. Instead, the railroad brought men like Rourke, who decided water was worth more than beef." Two Moons finished binding Eliza's feet with strips of clean cloth, then sat back on his heels with the patient stillness she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. "How much time do we have?" he asked. 2 weeks, maybe less." Rowan's voice was flat, matter of fact, but Eliza could see the storm building behind his controlled exterior. "Rourke's been patient because he wants the ranch intact, that prime grazing land, and the rights to the underground aquifer that feeds our springs. But if I can't make the payment, he gets everything." The pieces were beginning to fall into place for Eliza, forming a picture that was both clearer and more complex than she'd initially understood. This wasn't just about her desperate journey, or even the plight of Dry Mercy's 31 souls. It was about power and water, and the kind of men who thought they could own both. "The hot springs Rourke dammed," she said slowly, working through the implications. "They're part of the same watershed that feeds your ranch." "The headwaters," Two Moons confirmed. "Before the white men came, my people called this whole valley where the water sings. The springs were sacred healing water that never froze, never ran dry. Now they power machines that crush rock and make one man rich while others die of thirst." Another contraction gripped Eliza, milder than the earlier ones, but still strong enough to make her breath catch. When it passed, she found both men watching her with renewed concern, but she waved off their worry with a gesture that was becoming familiar. "I'm a telegraph operator," she said, surprising them with the apparent change of subject. "Was, anyway, before I married Thomas. 4 years handling messages for half the territory, including railroad communications during construction seasons." She could see Rowan beginning to understand, his storm cloud eyes brightening with something that might have been hope. "You know their systems, their codes and protocols." "Better than that," Eliza replied, allowing herself a small smile despite the circumstances. "I know their weaknesses. Railroad companies rely on telegraph coordination for everything: payroll, supply shipments, personnel transfers. Disrupt their communications at the right time, in the right way, and you can create chaos that looks like normal operational confusion." Two Moons leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "You're thinking of more than just reaching the springs." "I'm thinking of opening them," Eliza said, the plan crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke. "Permanently. If we can prove that the watershed is a navigable waterway under territorial law, Rorke's Dam becomes illegal. But we'd need to create evidence-actual water flow that a territorial judge could see and measure." Rowan stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small cabin with the restless energy of a man who'd been handed unexpected hope. "The old irrigation channel. My grandfather dug it to carry spring water to the lower pastures. But it's been dry for 2 years since Rourke built his dam. If we could get the water flowing again, even temporarily." The judge rides circuit through Sweetgrass Valley every month. 2, Moons added thoughtfully. "Next visit is scheduled for week after next. If he could see water in that channel, flowing toward Dry Mercy, he'd have grounds to void Rourke's water rights and declare the springs public access." Eliza felt the baby kick, as if responding to the growing excitement in the room. "But it would take more than just opening the dam. We'd need to make sure Rourke's guards couldn't stop us long enough for the legal proceedings to begin." The brand iron caught the firelight again, its metal surface reflecting the dancing flames like a mirror of possibilities. 3 generations of Ashford dreams hung in the balance, along with 31 lives in Dry Mercy and the future of water rights throughout the territory. "It's dangerous," Rowan said quietly. "Rourke's guards have orders to shoot on sight. They've already killed 2 prospectors who got too close to the springs. Everything worthwhile is dangerous," Eliza replied, thinking of her 3-day walk through blizzard country with death nipping at her heels. "The question is whether the risk is proportional to what we stand to gain." 2 Moons reached up to touch the brand iron, his fingers tracing the star and A design with reverence. "My grandmother would say the signs are clear. The woman who walks through winter carrying new life. The man who holds water rights in trust, the sacred springs that remember their true purpose. This is not coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidence," Rowan said, his gaze moving between Eliza and the locket on the wall. "Catherine used to say that everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see the pattern, maybe especially then." Another contraction, stronger this time, reminded them all that they were working against more than one deadline. The baby was coming whether their plans succeeded or failed, and Eliza's survival along with her child's depended on more than just warm shelter and 2 Moons' healing skills. "How long do we have?" Rowan asked, kneeling beside the sleeping platform where Eliza rested. "First babies usually take their time," she replied, though uncertainty colored her voice. "But stress and cold can change everything. Could be days, could be hours." 2 Moons stood and moved to the window, peering out at the landscape that stretched white and unforgiving toward the distant peaks. "The weather is holding steady. No new storms on the horizon. If we're going to act, conditions won't get better than this." Rowan's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the internal struggle plain on his face. Every instinct probably told him to keep her safe and warm until the baby was born, to avoid any risk that might endanger either mother or child. But Eliza could see him weighing that against the lives hanging in the balance back in Dry Mercy, against his own looming debt to Rourke, against the possibility that this moment might be their only chance. "If we wait," Eliza said softly, "people die. If we act and fail, people die. But if we act and succeed, we change everything." Rowan finished. "Not just for Dry Mercy or the Star A, but for every settlement in the territory that's ever been held hostage by men who think they can own water." The brand iron seemed to glow in the firelight, that bold star design representing not just the Ashford legacy but something larger, the idea that some things were too essential for private ownership, too vital for one man's profit. Water, like air and sunlight, belonged to everyone who needed it to survive. "Then we plan," 2 Moons said simply, "and we trust that the spirits who brought us together will guide us through what comes next." The railroad survey map spread across the cabin's wooden table like a blueprint for conquest, its precise lines and measurements documenting Silas Rourke's systematic appropriation of the Sweetgrass Valley watershed. Eliza studied the detailed drawings with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years translating complex communications into actionable intelligence, her finger tracing the route of the original hot springs and the newer lines that showed Rourke's dam and power station. "He's diverted everything," she murmured, noting how the natural flow had been channeled into a series of artificial waterways that served the ore crushers and processing equipment. "The springs that used to feed your grandfather's irrigation channel are now powering machines that extract silver from rock." Two Moons leaned over her shoulder, his weathered face grim as he studied the map's implications. 30 years I've been working this land, and I've never seen the springs run dry. Even in the worst drought years, there was always water flowing toward the valley. Now, he gestured toward the precise engineering drawings that showed how Rourke had captured every drop for industrial use. Rowan paced behind them, his restless energy filling the small cabin like electricity before a storm. The past 2 hours had transformed him from a man weighed down by impossible circumstances into someone discovering the possibility of action. It was a change that went deeper than simple hope. There was something almost fierce in his expression now, as if Eliza's arrival had awakened parts of himself he'd thought lost with Catherine. "The guard posts are here, here, and here," he said, pointing to 3 positions marked on the map. "Rourke's got them positioned to cover the approaches to both the dam and the processing station. But they're thinking about claim jumpers and desperate prospectors, not about someone who understands their communication systems." Eliza nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. Railroad operations run on schedules. Shift changes, supply deliveries, payroll, escorts, everything happens at predictable intervals. If I could access their telegraph lines during a scheduled communication window. "You could send false orders," Rowan finished, understanding immediately. "Pull the guards away from the springs during a phantom emergency." "Better than that," Eliza said, warming to the concept. "I could create a cascade of confusion that would take hours to untangle. False reports of Indian trouble near their supply depot, urgent requests for guard details to escort a non-existent payroll shipment, emergency orders to relocate equipment due to flooding that isn't actually happening." Two Moons smiled, the expression transforming his normally stoic features. "Like leading buffalo over a cliff by making them think the grass is greener on the other side." Another contraction seized Eliza, this one strong enough to make her grip the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. When it passed, she found both men watching her with renewed concern, but she pushed ahead before they could object to the plan on medical grounds. "The timing has to be perfect," she said, her voice steady despite the growing urgency in her body. "We need the guards away from the dam for at least 2 hours, long enough to set charges and create enough of a breach to restore flow to the old irrigation channel." "Charges," Rowan repeated thoughtfully. "Rourke's got dynamite stored at his construction depot, but it's guarded separately from the springs." "Not a problem if we're creating enough confusion," Eliza replied. "One of my phantom emergencies can pull those guards away too. The trick is coordinating everything so the chaos builds on itself instead of revealing the deception." She turned back to the map, noting the positions of telegraph lines and the distances between key installations. "The main communication hub is here, at the processing station. If I can access it during the night shift change, when operators are most likely to accept unusual orders without questioning them too closely." "You'll be in labor," Two Moons said quietly, "perhaps actively delivering. This is not a time for a woman to be climbing telegraph poles and infiltrating enemy positions." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Eliza felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "This baby is due in a month under normal circumstances," she said, meeting both men's eyes with steady determination. "But these aren't normal circumstances, and she seems to understand that timing matters. I can feel her settling, getting ready for whatever comes next." It was true, though she wasn't sure how she knew it. The wild, urgent movements of early labor had given way to something more purposeful, as if the child inside her was gathering strength for the ordeal ahead. There was something almost conspiratorial about the way the baby had quieted during their planning sessions, as if she too understood that their survival depended on more than just medical care and warm shelter. Rowan stopped pacing and came to stand beside the table, his eyes moving between the map and Eliza's face. "I won't lie to you," he said quietly. "This plan is dangerous even for experienced soldiers, let alone a woman about to give birth. If something goes wrong—" "People die either way," Eliza interrupted. "The difference is whether we die trying to change things or die waiting for someone else to save us." She thought about the 31 souls back in Dry Mercy, counting days by how much water remained in their dwindling stores. She thought about Thomas, who taught her that love sometimes meant taking impossible risks for the people who mattered most. And she thought about the baby inside her, who deserved to be born into a world where water wasn't a commodity controlled by men like Silas Rourke. "There's something else," Rowan said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd been wrestling with whether to reveal this information. "Rourke's lien on the Star, includes a clause about water rights. If he forecloses, he doesn't just get the ranch, gets exclusive access to the underground aquifer that feeds our springs." Two Moons looked up sharply. "You never mentioned this." "Because it seemed hopeless," Rowan admitted. "But if we can prove that the aquifer is part of a navigable waterway, if we can show a territorial judge actual water flowing through the old irrigation channel toward Dry Mercy, the lien becomes invalid," Eliza finished. "Rourke can't claim exclusive rights to water that's been legally established as a public resource." The implications were staggering. Success wouldn't just save Dry Mercy or preserve Rowan's family legacy, it would establish a legal precedent that could protect water rights throughout the territory. Failure, on the other hand, would consolidate Rourke's control over resources that dozens of communities depended on for survival. Another contraction, stronger and longer than any before, reminded them that their window for action was narrowing. When it passed, Eliza found herself looking at Catherine's locket on the wall, thinking about the woman who'd died for lack of medical care and the man who'd sworn never to let that happen again. "She would approve," she said softly, knowing somehow that it was true. "Catherine, she'd want you to take this risk." Rowan's face went still, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then his expression softened, and he reached up to touch the locket with gentle fingers. "She always said the hardest choices were usually the right ones," he murmured. "That courage wasn't about not being afraid, it was about being afraid and acting anyway." Two Moons folded the map with careful precision, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. "Then we prepare," he said simply, "and we trust that the water will remember its true path when we give it the chance to flow free again." Outside the cabin, wind whistled through the bare branches of the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of snow and the distant promise of spring. Somewhere in that wind, Eliza thought she could hear the echo of rushing water, as if the spirits of the damned springs were calling out for liberation. The dynamite crate bore Rourke's own railroad company markings, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on any of them as they crouched in the shadows of the construction depot at 3 in the morning. Eliza's phantom telegraph orders had worked better than expected. The guards had abandoned their posts an hour earlier, rushing north to investigate reports of a Cheyenne war party that existed only in the messages she'd tapped out on Rourke's own communication lines. 12 sticks, Two Moons whispered, carefully transferring the wrapped explosives to the canvas satchel Rowan had brought from the ranch. "More than enough to breach the dam's foundation if we place them correctly." Rowan nodded, his face grim in the moonlight. The plan had seemed almost elegant when they discussed it in the warmth of the line cabin, but here in the bitter cold, with Eliza's contractions coming every 20 minutes, the reality of what they were attempting felt overwhelming. They were about to commit acts that would be considered terrorism by some, liberation by others, with nothing but hope and desperation to guide them. Eliza leaned against a support beam, breathing slowly through another wave of pain that seemed to squeeze her entire torso like a giant's fist. The baby had definitely dropped lower in the past few hours, and she could feel the pressure building towards something inevitable. But not yet, she told her unborn daughter silently. Not until we finish what we came here to do. The charges need to be set at the dam's eastern foundation, she said quietly when the contraction passed. That's where the original spring channel curves closest to the structure. Breach it there, and the water will naturally flow back toward the old irrigation route. They'd studied Rowan's grandfather's original surveying notes by lamplight, tracing the path water had followed for generations before Rourke's engineers had decided they could improve on nature's design. The old irrigation channel was still there, filled with debris and choked with ice, but structurally sound enough to carry water if they could restore the flow. "What about the territorial water law you mentioned?" Rowan asked as they began moving carefully through the shadows toward the dam site. "The navigable waterway provision?" Eliza smiled grimly, remembering the telegram that had changed everything, not the message she'd sent, but one she'd received during her final week as a telegraph operator in Dry Mercy. A legal opinion from the Territorial Attorney General's office, forwarded through Western Union to every settlement in Wyoming. Any waterway that can carry a boat or raft for commercial purposes is considered navigable under federal law, which supersedes private claims. "But there's no boat traffic up here," Two Moons pointed out practically. "There will be," Eliza replied with growing confidence. "Judge Morrison rides the circuit in a boat when the rivers are high enough. He floats down from Sweetgrass Springs to Twin Forks every spring during snowmelt. If we can show him water flowing from the springs toward Dry Mercy, if we can prove the route is navigable, he'll have to rule that Rourke's dam is illegally blocking a public waterway." Rowan finished, understanding dawning in his voice. "The water rights revert to territorial control." They reached the edge of the dam site, where Rourke's engineering marvel rose from the canyon like a concrete monument to human ambition. In daylight, it was impressive, a curved wall that channeled the full force of the hot springs into turbines that powered the ore crushers. In moonlight, it looked like exactly what it was, a barrier that had cut off the natural flow of water to communities downstream. Another contraction seized Eliza, this one strong enough to double her over despite her determination to keep moving. When it passed, she found both men looking at her with expressions that mixed admiration with deep concern. "How much time do we have?" Two Moons asked gently. "Enough," she said, though she wasn't entirely certain. The baby seemed to be following her own schedule, one that didn't necessarily align with their operational timeline. "Let's finish this." They worked in careful silence, Two Moons using his knowledge of construction to identify the optimal placement points, while Rowan set the charges with the precision of someone who'd learned demolition techniques during his brief stint at the Colorado School of Mines. Eliza maintained watch, her trained ear alert for any sound that might indicate returning guards or unexpected complications. It was while she was monitoring their perimeter that she heard the voices. "Told you this was a waste of time," one man was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "No Indian war party would come within 50 miles of these springs. The Cheyenne know better than to tangle with Rourke's operation." "Orders are orders," replied another voice, this one with the flat authority of someone accustomed to command. "Mr. Rourke said, investigate every report, no matter how unlikely." Eliza's blood turned to ice as she realized what was happening. The guards were returning early. Their investigation of her phantom war party concluded more quickly than she'd anticipated. In minutes, they'd discover the missing dynamite, the breached security, and the three figures working to destroy their employer's most valuable asset. She moved as quickly as her condition allowed, reaching Rowan and Two Moons just as they finished placing the final charges. "Guards coming back," she whispered urgently, maybe 10 minutes before they reached the dam. Rowan cursed softly, his hands moving to check the fuses and timing mechanisms. "We need at least 15 minutes to get clear of the blast radius. Then we make our choice," Two Moons said calmly. "Run now and abort the mission, or light the fuses and trust our legs to carry us fast enough." Another contraction chose that moment to grip Eliza, this one so intense she had to bite down on her mitten to keep from crying out. When it passed, she found both men looking at her with expressions that said everything about the impossible position they'd put themselves in. "Light them," she said firmly. "If we run now, we lose everything. If we stay, we at least have a chance." Rowan struck the match with steady hands, touching it to the first fuse and watching the spark catch and begin its inexorable journey toward the explosives. The smell of sulfur and burning hemp filled the air, sharp and final as a funeral pyre. "Move," Two Moons said simply, and they did. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Eliza's life, a desperate scramble through snow and shadow, with the voices of Rourke's guards growing closer behind them, and the baby inside her pressing downward with increasing urgency. They reached the shelter of a boulder field just as the night exploded in a cascade of thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. The dam didn't collapse so much as transform, its eastern foundation disappearing in a geyser of concrete and steam as the pent-up force of the hot springs found its freedom. Water poured through the breach like a living thing, following the path of least resistance toward the old irrigation channel with a roar that could be heard for miles. "It's working," Rowan breathed, watching the liberated water race downhill toward the Star, a ranch, and beyond it, toward Dry Mercy. "The flow is stronger than I expected. It'll reach the settlement by morning." But Eliza barely heard him. Another contraction was building, this one different from all the others, deeper, more urgent, accompanied by a sensation that felt like her body preparing for something momentous. She gripped Two Moons' arm, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. "The baby," she gasped. "She's coming now." In the distance, they could hear Rourke's guards shouting over the roar of rushing water, their voices carrying confusion and alarm as they discovered what had been done to their employer's masterwork. But that seemed suddenly less important than the new life-demanding entrance into a world where water once again flowed free toward the people who needed it most. Two Moons knelt beside her in the snow, his weathered hands already moving to assist with a delivery that would happen whether they were ready or not. Above them, the aurora borealis danced green and gold across the star-scattered sky, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the liberation of the sacred springs. "Easy," Two Moons murmured, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd helped bring life into the world before. "Let your body do what it knows how to do." Rowan stood guard with his rifle, watching for signs that Rourke's men might discover their position, but his eyes kept returning to Eliza's face as she worked to bring forth the child who would be born into freedom rather than thirst. The water sang its way downhill, carrying hope toward Dry Mercy, on currents that had run free for the first time in 2 years. And in that song, Eliza thought she could hear the voice of every woman who'd ever walked impossible distances for love, every person who'd ever believed that some things were too precious to be owned by those who thought money could buy them. The lantern signal system they'd rigged between the boulder field and the dam site flickered like artificial stars against the darkness, each flash of light carrying coded messages in the Morse alphabet that had become as natural to Eliza as breathing. Even as her body prepared for the monumental work of childbirth, her mind remained focused on the tactical necessities that would determine whether their desperate gambit succeeded or failed catastrophically. 3 long flashes means the guards have discovered the breach, she explained to Rowan between contractions that were now coming every 5 minutes. 2 short, 1 long means they're organizing a search pattern. Continuous, rapid flashing means we need to abort and run. Two Moons had positioned himself at the observation point they'd established on higher ground, where he could monitor both the dam site and the route the liberated water was taking toward the old irrigation channel. The lantern in his hands had been modified with a metal shield that could direct its beam in specific patterns, turning a simple camping tool into a sophisticated communication device. "The water's flowing stronger than we calculated," Rowan reported, studying the torrent that poured through the breach they'd created in Rourke's dam. "At this rate, it'll reach the Star A irrigation channel within the hour and Dry Mercy by sunrise." Another contraction seized Eliza, this one so powerful it felt like her entire body was being reorganized from the inside. When it passed, she found herself thinking about timing with the clarity that came from necessity. The baby was definitely coming tonight, but the question was whether they could complete their mission before labor made further action impossible. "Judge Morrison's not due for his circuit ride for another week," she said, gripping Rowan's hand as another wave of pain began building. "But if we can maintain the water flow until then, if we can show him a navigable channel carrying spring water toward multiple settlements, he'll have legal grounds to declare the waterway a public resource." Rowan finished. Rourke's water rights become void, and his lien on the star loses its foundation. The implications went far beyond personal survival, though those stakes were certainly high enough. Success would establish precedent that could protect water access throughout the territory, preventing future Rourkes from monopolizing resources that entire communities depended on. Failure would not only cost lives in dry mercy, but would consolidate corporate control over water in ways that might prove irreversible. Two Moon's lantern began flashing a complex pattern: short, long, pause, long, short. Eliza translated automatically, multiple riders approaching from the north. Estimate 20 minutes. "Rourke himself," Rowan said grimly. "He'll have gotten word about the explosion by now, when he sees what we've done to his dam." He didn't need to finish the thought. Silas Rourke hadn't built his railroad empire by accepting setbacks gracefully, and the destruction of his water control system would be seen as both financial disaster and personal affront. The man would bring every resource at his disposal to bear on stopping the water flow and punishing those responsible. Another contraction, stronger and longer than any before, reminded them that their window for action was rapidly closing. Eliza found herself thinking about the stories Two Moons had told about his grandmother's teachings, about the spiritual significance of water and new life arriving together under the dancing lights of the aurora. "There's something else we need to consider," she said when the pain subsided enough for speech. "Even if we establish the legal precedent, even if Judge Morrison rules in our favor, Rourke will appeal to federal court. That could take months, maybe years. Long enough for him to find other ways to control the water," Rowan agreed. Unless we make it impossible for him to rebuild," Two Moons said, appearing suddenly beside them with the quiet efficiency that seemed to be his natural state. "The riders are closer than expected. Rourke's brought at least a dozen men, maybe more." Eliza felt another contraction beginning, this one accompanied by a sensation that felt like the baby dropping even lower, preparing for her entrance into a world that was about to become considerably more dangerous. "How much time do we have?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. Two Moons knelt beside her, his weathered hands already moving to assist with the delivery that was clearly imminent. "The child has chosen her moment. Well, she'll be born free or not at all." The philosophical implications of that statement might have been profound under other circumstances, but Eliza was rapidly losing the capacity for abstract thought. Her body was taking control, preparing for the ancient work of bringing forth new life, and everything else, the tactical situation, the legal precedents, even her own survival was becoming secondary to that fundamental imperative. "The charges," she gasped, as another wave of pain crested. "At the processing station, if someone could. Destroy Rourke's entire operation," Rowan said, understanding immediately. "Make it financially impossible for him to rebuild quickly enough to matter." It was a desperate idea, the kind of plan that was either brilliantly comprehensive or completely insane. Destroying the dam had been about restoring natural water flow. Destroying the processing station would be about eliminating Rourke's ability to profit from the valley's resources in any form. "I can reach it," Rowan said quietly. "The approach route we scouted earlier. If I move now, while his men are focused on the dam." "No." Eliza's voice was firm despite the pain that was building toward something overwhelming. "We finish this together, or we don't finish it at all." Two Moons smiled, his dark eyes reflecting the aurora light that painted the sky in shades of green and gold. The woman speaks wisdom. This is not a task for one person to carry alone. Another contraction, the strongest yet, made further conversation impossible for several minutes. When it passed, Eliza found herself looking up at the dancing lights above them, thinking about all the women who'd given birth under similar circumstances in covered wagons crossing the plains, in frontier cabins with only a neighbor woman to assist, in circumstances where new life had to fight its way into existence against overwhelming odds. "She's coming," Two Moons said softly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "The baby's crowning. Just a few more minutes now." Rowan positioned himself where he could watch for approaching riders while still remaining close enough to assist if needed. The lantern signals had gone quiet, but they could hear hoofbeats now, the sound of multiple horses moving through snow with the urgency of men who'd discovered a significant financial loss. "They'll try to stop the water flow first," he said, more to himself than to the others, "but the breach is too wide to repair quickly. They'll need engineering equipment, concrete, maybe a full construction crew." "Which gives us time," Eliza managed to say between the waves of pain that were now coming continuously. "Time for the legal process. Time for word to spread about what we've done here." The baby's head emerged with a rush of fluid and sensation that made Eliza cry out despite her determination to remain quiet. Two Moons supported the infant's head with gentle hands, murmuring something in Cheyenne that sounded like either a prayer or a blessing. "One more push," he said softly. "Your daughter is almost ready to meet the world." Above them, the aurora borealis painted the sky in brilliant green spirals, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the moment when new life and liberated water would enter the world together. In the distance, the sound of approaching riders grew louder, but somehow that seemed less important than the miracle taking place in the snow between the boulder field and the singing springs. Eliza gathered her strength for what she knew would be the final effort, thinking about Thomas and the love that had created this moment, about the 31 souls in Dry Mercy who were counting on water that was already flowing toward them, about the future this child would inherit if they could complete what they'd started. The next contraction built like a storm approaching from the horizon, and Eliza Carter prepared to bring forth new life in a world where water once again ran free. The telegraph wire cutters gleamed in Two Moons' weathered hands like surgical instruments as he severed the final communication line, connecting Rourke's processing station to the outside world. The metallic snap of parting copper was barely audible over the roar of water pouring through the dam breach, but to Eliza it sounded like the breaking of chains that had bound the valley's water for 2 years. "That's the last one," Two Moons said softly, coiling the useless wire with the methodical precision of someone who understood the symbolic weight of what they'd just accomplished. "Rourke's operation is now completely isolated. No way to call for reinforcements or coordinate a response." Eliza nodded, though most of her attention was focused on the overwhelming sensations coursing through her body as the baby continued her determined journey into the world. Between contractions that now came with relentless frequency, she found herself thinking about the irony of using Rourke's own infrastructure against his telegraph lines to create confusion, his dynamite to destroy his dam, his communication systems to ensure his isolation when he needed help most. "How close are the riders?" Rowan asked, his voice tight with the strain of dividing his attention between the approaching threat and the birth happening in the snow beside him. "Close enough to see the steam from the breach." "Two," Moons replied, gesturing toward the column of vapor that rose from the damaged dam like smoke from a funeral pyre. "But far enough that we still have time to finish what we started." Another contraction seized Eliza, this one so powerful it felt like her entire body was being turned inside out. When it passed, she found herself looking at Rowan's face in the aurora light, seeing something in his expression that went beyond tactical concern or even personal care. There was something almost reverent in the way he watched her struggle to bring forth new life, as if witnessing a kind of courage he'd never seen before. "The baby's coming." "Two," Moons announced, his hands moving with practiced efficiency to support the emerging infant. "I can see the shoulders. One more push, and your daughter will be breathing free air." The sound of hoofbeats was growing louder, accompanied now by voices that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Rourke's men were discovering the extent of the damage, their shouts reflecting shock at the volume of water pouring through the breach and confusion about how such a thing could have been accomplished. "Sir, the entire eastern foundation is gone," one voice called out, probably a foreman or engineer. "This wasn't some kind of structural failure. Someone blew it up deliberately." "Find them," came the response, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. That would be Rourke himself. Eliza realized, a man accustomed to solving problems through the application of sufficient force and money. "I want whoever did this brought to me alive. They're going to watch me rebuild this dam bigger and stronger than before." The final contraction built like a mountain avalanche, irresistible and overwhelming. Eliza bore down with every ounce of strength remaining in her exhausted body, feeling the baby slip free in a rush of sensation that left her gasping and shaking. Then Two Moons was lifting something small and perfect into the aurora light, and a thin cry pierced the night air, high and clear and unmistakably alive. "A daughter." "Two Moons," said softly, his voice carrying wonder despite the dangerous circumstances. "Born free under the dancing lights, with the water singing its way back to the people who need it." Rowan's face transformed as he looked down at the infant, something breaking open in his expression that spoke of grief finally finding its way to healing. For just a moment, the tactical situation and the approaching threat seemed less important than the miracle of new life entering a world where hope had been restored. But the moment couldn't last. The hoofbeats were closer now, and torchlight was beginning to flicker through the trees as Rourke's men spread out to search for whoever had destroyed their employer's masterwork. "We need to move," Rowan said quietly, his hand finding Eliza's shoulder with gentle pressure. "Can you travel?" Eliza looked down at her daughter Thomas's daughter, seeing tiny features that were already beginning to show hints of the man she'd loved. The baby's eyes were open, dark and alert, as if she understood the gravity of the situation into which she'd been born. "I can do whatever needs doing," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "But we're not running anymore. We're going to finish this." Two Moons wrapped the baby in clean cloth from his medical supplies, then helped Eliza into a sitting position against the boulder that had sheltered them during the delivery. "What did you have in mind?" "The processing station," Eliza said, her mind working with the clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. "Rourke's whole operation depends on those ore crushers and the machinery that separates silver from rock. Destroy that, and it'll take him months to rebuild if he can afford to rebuild at all." "The charges we set there earlier," Rowan said, understanding immediately, "but the timer mechanisms, we'd have to light the fuses manually." "Then we light them," Eliza said simply. "All of us. Together." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but something softer, a kind of conversational murmur that seemed to indicate she was settling into this strange new world with typical frontier pragmatism. Eliza found herself smiling despite everything, thinking about how this child would grow up with stories of the night she was born beside liberated springs under the dancing lights of the aurora. "They're getting closer," Two Moons observed, watching the torchlights weave through the forest. "Maybe 10 minutes before they reach this position." "Enough time," Rowan said, checking his rifle and ensuring the ammunition was secure. "If we move fast and don't waste energy on anything that doesn't serve the mission." Another sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of water rushing through channels that had been dry for 2 years, following the path Rowan's grandfather had carved toward the Star A Ranch and beyond. The liberated springs were already doing their work, carrying hope toward dry mercy on currents that ran deeper than mere hydrology. "Listen," Eliza whispered, holding her daughter close as the sound of flowing water mixed with the approaching hoofbeats. "She's hearing the song of free water for the first time, the song we nearly died to restore." Two Moons gathered the wire cutters with reverent care, tucking them into his coat like sacred artifacts. "These severed the chains that bound the valley's lifeblood," he said quietly. "They deserve honor for the work they've done tonight." The baby's eyes seemed to track the aurora lights dancing overhead, as if she were already learning to read the stories written in green fire across the star-scattered sky. In that gaze, Eliza saw something that looked like recognition, not of the world she'd been born into, but of the courage it had taken to make that world possible. "Time to move," Rowan said, extending his hand to help Eliza to her feet. "The processing station won't destroy itself, and Rourke's men are close enough now to smell the gunpowder residue from the dam charges." As they prepared to make their final approach toward Rourke's industrial complex, Eliza felt the weight of everything they'd accomplished and everything that still hung in the balance. The water was flowing free, her daughter had been born under liberated skies, and the tools that had severed Rourke's communication lines lay ready to be wielded again if needed. But the hardest part still lay ahead. The newborn's first cry pierced the explosion's roar like a silver needle through thunder, announcing her arrival into a world transformed by cascading water and the complete collapse of Silas Rourke's industrial empire. Steam billowed from the ruins of the processing station, where ore crushers that had ground mountain stone into profit now lay twisted and silent beneath tons of debris. Eliza held her daughter against her chest, feeling the baby's heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm of water rushing through channels that had been dry for 2 years. The infant's cry had been brief but piercing a sound that somehow cut through the chaos of destruction and the shouts of Rourke's men discovering the extent of their losses. "She's got strong lungs, too," Moons observed with satisfaction, his weathered face reflecting the orange glow of fires that burned where industrial machinery had stood moments before. "A good sign. She'll need that strength for the world she's inheriting." Rowan stood guard with his rifle, watching for movement among the shadows cast by the burning wreckage. The explosion had been even more comprehensive than they'd planned, not just destroying the ore processing equipment, but taking out the power station that had fed Rourke's entire operation. Without those crushers, without the infrastructure to extract silver from raw ore, the railroad barons' control over the valley's resources had been reduced to rubble and smoke. "Look," he said quietly, pointing toward the old irrigation channel that wound its way down from the springs. "The water's already flowing past the star, a boundary markers. It'll reach Dry Mercy before sunrise." The sight was almost biblical, a silver ribbon of life-giving water racing through terrain that had been bone dry for months. Following the route Rowan's grandfather had carved, with nothing but vision and back-breaking labor. Moonlight turned the stream into molten mercury, and the sound of its passage was like whispered prayers answered after years of drought. Another sound rose above the chaos Rourke's voice, bellowing orders that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Find them. They can't have gone far, not with all this equipment to carry. I want them alive, so they can watch me rebuild everything they've destroyed." But his words carried an edge of desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand the true scope of what had been lost. This wasn't simple sabotage that could be repaired with sufficient money and effort. The destruction of the processing station, combined with the breaching of the dam, had eliminated years of investment and infrastructure development. "He doesn't know about the baby," Eliza whispered, adjusting her grip on the infant, who had settled into peaceful quiet after her dramatic entrance. "He's still thinking in terms of capturing fugitives, not understanding that we've just given birth to the future of water rights in this territory." Two Moons smiled at that phrasing, his dark eyes reflecting the aurora light that continued to dance across the sky in spirals of green and gold. "In my grandmother's stories, children born during great changes carry the power to complete what their parents started. This little one will grow up knowing that some things are too sacred to be owned." The baby stirred in Eliza's arms, making soft sounds that weren't quite crying but seemed to indicate she was taking inventory of this strange new world. Her tiny fist closed around Eliza's finger with surprising strength, and in that grip, Eliza felt something like a promise that this child would inherit not just the water they'd liberated tonight, but the understanding that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. "The judges will come," Rowan said with quiet confidence, watching the water race towards settlements that had been dying of thirst just hours before. Judge Morrison, probably others, once word spreads about what we've accomplished. They'll see the water flowing through established channels toward multiple communities, and they'll have to rule that it's a navigable public waterway. Rourke will fight it, Eliza pointed out, though she felt too exhausted and too euphoric to worry much about future legal battles. He's got money and political connections. He won't accept this kind of loss without using every resource at his disposal. Let him fight, Two Moons said simply. He's fighting the water itself now, and water always wins eventually. It finds its way around obstacles, wears down resistance, follows the path that's meant to be followed. The sound of hoofbeats was fading as Rourke's men spread out in their search, moving away from the actual location where their quarry had taken shelter. The confusion created by the explosions and the darkness had worked in their favor, giving them time to catch their breath and assess what they'd accomplished. 31 people in dry mercy, Eliza said softly, more to herself than to the others. By the time the sun comes up, they'll have all the water they need. Clean water, from springs that have been flowing since before any of us were born. The baby made another small sound, and Eliza found herself humming the same hymn she'd sung during her desperate walk through the wilderness. Amazing Grace, her mother's favorite, sung now as a lullaby for a daughter who would never know the thirst that had driven her mother to attempt the impossible. Above them, the aurora borealis reached its crescendo, painting the sky in colors that seemed to celebrate the night's accomplishments. Green fire danced between the stars, and in its patterns Eliza thought she could see the faces of everyone who had made this moment possible. Thomas, whose love had given her the strength to begin the journey. Her father, whose telegram skills had provided the tools for victory. Even Rourke himself, whose greed had created the circumstances that demanded such desperate action. She needs a name, Rowan said quietly, looking down at the infant with an expression that mixed wonder with something deeper, the kind of protective love that had nothing to do with blood relation and everything to do with witness to courage. Eliza considered the question, thinking about the woman who'd walked 100 miles through winter wilderness, about the men who'd helped her complete an impossible mission, about the child who'd chosen to be born at the moment when water returned to freedom. Hope, she said finally. Her name is Hope Carter, and she's going to grow up in a world where water belongs to the people who need it, not to the men who think they can buy it. Two Moons nodded approvingly. A good name. A name that speaks of what's possible when people refuse to accept that some things can't be changed. In the distance, the sound of flowing water continued its ancient song, carrying life toward places that had been dying, and carrying news of victory toward settlements that had been losing faith. And in Eliza's arms, Hope Carter slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams come to children born under dancing lights in a world made new by their mother's courage. The territorial judge's water rights decree lay spread across the kitchen table like a map to a new world, its official seals and precise legal language establishing what Eliza, Rowan, and Two Moons had written in dynamite and determination 6 weeks earlier. Judge Morrison's careful script declared the Sweetgrass Valley watershed a navigable public waterway, voiding Silas Rourke's claims and establishing precedent that would protect water access throughout Wyoming Territory. Article 7, Section 3. Eliza read aloud, holding baby Hope with one arm while tracing the relevant passage with her free hand. Any waterway capable of supporting commercial navigation shall be considered a public trust, immune from private appropriation, regardless of adjacent property ownership. She looked up at Rowan, who stood by the window, watching morning light dance on the creek that now flowed year-round past the Star A Ranch headquarters. We did it. We actually did it. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Within days of the dam's destruction, water had reached not just Dry Mercy, but 6 other settlements that had been struggling with drought and failed wells. Families that had been preparing to abandon their claims instead found themselves with abundant, clean water flowing past their doors. Children who had been rationing cups of melted snow were splashing in creeks that ran clear and cold from the liberated springs. 2 moons emerged from the back room, where he'd been tending the small shrine he'd built to honor the spirits of the watershedder, simple arrangement of stones and sacred herbs that somehow seemed to make the whole house feel more connected to the land around it. "The morning prayers are complete," he announced with satisfaction. "The water spirits are pleased with what we've accomplished." Hope gurgled in response, her dark eyes tracking the movement of dust motes in the sunbeam that slanted through the kitchen window. At 6 weeks old, she was already showing signs of the alertness and determination that had characterized her dramatic birth. 2 moons insisted she was blessed by water spirits. Rowan claimed she had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubborn streak. Eliza just knew she was perfect. "Any word from Rourke's lawyers?" Rowan asked, settling into the chair across from Eliza with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the weeks of recovery and legal proceedings. "They're still filing appeals," Eliza replied, folding the decree carefully and placing it in the wooden box where they kept their most important documents. But Judge Morrison was thorough. He rode the entire waterway himself, documented the flow rates, interviewed settlers in every community that benefits from the springs. "The legal foundation is solid." It had been a strange courtship, she reflected, built on shared danger rather than conventional romance, cemented by the care Rowan had shown during her recovery and the gentle way he'd taken to fatherhood, despite having no biological claim to the role. He'd asked her to marry him 3 weeks after Hope's birth, not with flowers and poetry, but with a simple statement that they'd built something worth protecting together. "I know it's not what you planned," he'd said, standing beside the creek that flowed past the ranch house, "but I think maybe the best things never are. We've got water flowing free, a baby who deserves parents who'll fight for her future, and land that could support a family if we're willing to work for it." She'd said yes, not because she needed rescuing. The woman who'd walked 100 miles through blizzard country didn't need anyone's protection, but because she'd found in Rowan Ashford a partner who understood that love sometimes meant doing impossible things for the people who mattered most. The wedding had been simple, held beside the spring that now flowed unrestricted toward the communities that depended on it. 2 moons had performed the ceremony, blending Christian traditions with Cheyenne blessings that honored both the union of 2 hearts and the liberation of the water that had brought them together. Hope had slept peacefully through the entire service, as if she approved of the arrangement. "Mrs. Gunderson sent another letter," Rowan said, retrieving an envelope from the mantelpiece. "Dry Mercy's population is back up to 47 souls, with 3 more families arriving last week. They're talking about building a proper school, maybe even a church." Eliza smiled, thinking about the woman who'd tried to talk her out of that desperate journey, and who now wrote weekly letters full of gratitude and community news. The settlement had not just survived, but begun to thrive, its future secured by water that flowed reliable and clean from springs that had been held captive for too long. "The Henderson children want to name the new creek after Hope," she said, unfolding Mrs. Gunderson's letter to read the relevant passage. "They think it's appropriate, since she was born the same night the water came back." 2 moons laughed, the sound rich with pleasure. "Hope Creek, I like that. It speaks of what's possible when people refuse to accept that some things can't be changed." Outside, the sound of flowing water provided constant background music, not just the creek that passed the ranch house, but the network of streams and channels that now carried snowmelt and spring water throughout the valley. The morning air carried the scent of green things growing, of life returning to places that had been too dry to support anything but the hardiest survivors. Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, but something more conversational, as if she were commenting on the adult discussion happening around her. Eliza adjusted her position, marveling at how natural it felt to hold this tiny person who represented so much hope for the future. "She's going to grow up knowing this story," Rowan said quietly, reaching out to touch one of Hope's perfect small hands. "She'll know that her mother walked 100 miles through winter to save people she'd never met, that sometimes the right thing to do is also the impossible thing to do. She'll know that water belongs to everyone who needs it, Eliza added, thinking about the legal precedent they'd established and the communities it would protect. She'll grow up in a world where corporate greed can't hold entire regions hostage for profit. 2 moons moved to the window, looking out at the landscape that had been transformed by their desperate night's work. She'll know that some things are sacred, he said simply. Water, life, the courage to act when action is required. These are gifts that can't be bought or sold. The territorial judge's decree represented more than just legal victoriate, was proof that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary power when they were willing to risk everything for what they believed was right. The precedent would spread beyond Wyoming Territory, Eliza was certain, inspiring other communities to assert their rights to resources that sustained life itself. As if sensing the weight of these thoughts, Hope opened her eyes and looked directly at her mother with an expression that seemed remarkably wise for someone who'd been breathing for only 6 weeks. In that gaze, Eliza saw echoes of Thomas's determination, reflections of her own stubborn refusal to accept defeat, and something new, a kind of peaceful confidence that suggested this child would grow up knowing she was born into freedom. "The spring celebration is next week," Rowan said, consulting the calendar they kept beside the stove. "Half the territory is planning to attend. People want to see the place where water rights were won back from corporate control." Eliza nodded, already planning how they'd manage hosting dozens of visitors while caring for an infant and maintaining the ranch work that never ended. It would be chaos, but good chaos, the kind that came from communities celebrating shared victory and renewed hope. Outside, the creek sang its ancient song, carrying snowmelt and spring water toward settlements that would never again have to choose between survival and submission to corporate control. And in the kitchen of the Star A Ranch, 3 adults and 1 very small child continued the daily work of building a future worthy of the courage it had taken to make it possible. Hope Carter Ashford slept peacefully in her mother's arms, dreaming whatever dreams come to children born under dancing lights, in a world where water runs free and courage creates its own precedent for what's possible when love refuses to accept the impossible.